From the archives of the great library of Arathes, golden city of elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 14. Fraenk blinked awake, staring into the face of a dark-eyed servant girl who looked to be about 17. "He lives still," she said flatly, more than a hint of disappointment in her tone. "Pity that." "Oh, Gwen, how could I torment you if I were dead?" Fraenk rasped through cracked lips. "A clever one like you would find a way," servant girl Gwen replied, then handed him a bowl of steaming amber-coloured soup. "You should eat something, though. If you died, then I'd be the one everyone would be trying to kill. Better if it's you." Fraenk took the bowl, then gave Gwen and the soup a leery look. "Oh, it's fine. I just brought it up fresh from the kitchen." Fraenk eased himself to a seated position and saw he was in his own quarters. He was also pleased to notice that all of his injuries did not seem to be bothering him at the moment. The healer's work was indeed miraculous. Fraenk scooped a large spoonful and swallowed. It was some kind of savoury broth with chunks of vegetables. Perhaps it was his hunger, but he had difficulty remembering anything so delicious. "It's good," Fraenk said, scooping up more. "Excellent. No shade wart," Gwen said. "I'll let Pollard know the soup is safe to serve." "What?" "I'm jesting," Gwen said, her face not suggestive that she even possessed a sense of humour. "Anyway, we caught the culprit 2 days ago. A Tigrenian dissident gone mad about his farm and fields being burned by our forces. He was slipping shadewort leaves with the Gollan greens in our regular delivery." "That's horrible. Our army burned him out of house and land?" Fraenk asked. "Don't worry, he was tried and hanged in the square this morning." Fraenk set the soup aside, his appetite gone. "I wish someone would consult me about these decisions," Fraenk said bitterly. "Well, the mythic Lord Neversleep was dead to the world. You can thank Nim for getting you back here before your reputation was shattered entirely," she said, taking a seat in Frank's padded chair. "Wait, how long was I out?" Fraenk asked, suddenly alarmed. 2.5 days. "That's madness." Fraenk swung his legs out of the bed onto the cold stone floor. A wave of dizziness hit him. I want a full report." He groaned against the pounding in his temples. "I can only do half of one because only half of the preceptors have reported in so far," Gwen said. "But it's the usual district morass, now with a steaming shovelful of Fernbrook skit thrown in." "What's this about the Fernbrooks?" "What about them? A pustulant boil on our backside. Whoever's idea it was to give them a foothold in the heart of our territory should be flogged in the neck with a headsman's axe. They've been harassing businesses around the market and generally being a nuisance in the district. It's taking all of our guys to keep things under our control. We need the Fernbrooks out of here, Fraenk." "I know." "Get them out, or they're going to take our district and we'll all be dead," Gwen said directly. "I will. I just need time to think." Gwen collected the bowl of soup and turned to leave. "Oh, and one more thing. That scary-looking hell-touched you were asking about was spotted twice more in the district." "I never said it was scary." "Oh, but he is," Gwen said. "You know, I've heard that people like to hire the hell-touched as assassins because the last thing you see before you die is the face of a demon." "How is that helpful?" Fraenk narrowed his eyes. "I don't know. Sounds like the kind of vindictive thing that the Greenbriars would do." "They're not allowed to come after me." "Yes, they're not," she said, looking at him directly. "Do you know where this supposed hell-touched assassin is?" "No," Gwen shrugged. "He's very good at cleverly slipping anyone who tails him. One might even suggest magically so." "I'm wondering why you bothered saying anything at all." "I require only good news from now on," Fraenk grumbled. He started to rise, and it suddenly occurred to him that he was naked. He clapped the blankets over himself. "Allow me to leave before I spy something that makes me regret most, if not all, of my recent decisions. Oh, my delicate young eyes." Gwen smirked. "Speaking of, what's with this latest glamour?" Fraenk said, gesturing to her younger appearance. Gwen sighed wearily. Our Lady Blackroot is now convinced one of the serving girls is stealing her jewellery. Fraenk suppressed a smile. Servant girl Gwen curtsied and flipped a stray lock of hair from her shoulder. "Infinite "An't please me, lady, can I fetch ye not tottle for ye Arkincornians?" Gwen intoned in a savage parody of servant girl patois. "Ugh, if one more of these aberrant lords' wandering pincers so much as considers a quest toward my delicate hams, I'll flatten 'em clean." How do the lady younglings even put up with this base treatment? Well, if you do catch our light-fingered maiden, try not to hang her immediately, for Grom's sake, Fraenk replied. When Gwen had taken her leave, Fraenk dressed and first checked all the trips he had set for any spies infiltrating his quarters. They were subtle indicators to show if an unseen agent had been about his effects while Fraenk was not there. Several of the standard ones had shown signs of disturbance, including one hidden compartment on his desk. He suspected that was the work of Gwen while he'd been unconscious, and there was nothing contained there that she shouldn't know about. In fact, he was heartened that she was putting her craft to work. She would make a good arch-preceptor of Blackroot someday. He was relieved to see that his most secure stashes were still all unmolested. Fraenk slid the heavy bookcase, then triggered the catch that released a false stone in the wall. He opened the small iron door with a key and peered into the dark space where he kept his most forbidden items. His fingers searched past the amethyst dagger of Zaldoria, a half-eaten jar of yellow honeyjack preserves, which wasn't magical, but Fraenk didn't like to share, and a rare copy of Beveron's tome of unwholesome body contortions, which was kept as evidence in a crime, and for no other reason. He finally found the item he was looking for. Fraenk lifted the pendant to eye level and watched it pendulum before him. Something odd occurred to him as he gazed at it. Most jewellery was designed to catch the light and dazzle the eye. A sparkle or a flare that sprang from every delicate facet. But the opposite effect seemed to be happening for this one. It had no glint or spark, nothing to attract attention. It seemed to eschew the gaze and disinterest of its beholder. The neck chain was a dull, tarnished metal that refused to be either iron or copper, and the stone set in it could have been the broken chip of cornerstone for a taxation office. Dull, unremarkable, and downright bland. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to make this particular item unappealing. It did not want to be seen. "Huh!" Fraenk exclaimed, dangling the necklace in the candlelight. The longer he stared at it, the more his eye wanted to look at something else, anything else. "Put it away," his inner voice urged. "Put it back in the wall and lock the door. Forget about it." Fraenk couldn't tell if this thought was echoing the words of the arch-partisan, wanting him to abandon this case, forget this clue. It would be easy and expedient to do so. He had much bigger problems fast approaching and bearing the sigil of Fernbrook. But he owed something to Meekan. And this Fernbrook business did have something to do with his death. Why did he suddenly want to give it up? He needed answers, and... Fraenk realized he was now just staring at the stone wall, the necklace laying on the floor. When he picked it up again, he felt that bored malaise start to return. "Oh," Fraenk said, a dawning realization came to him suddenly. This pendant had some kind of magic on it. In his brief but memorable experience with cursed objects, they all wanted to be worn so they could wreak their havoc. This one actually repelled attention and didn't want to be put on. Fraenk knew it was likely a very bad idea, but he needed to find out why this thing did not want to be worn. For all he knew, it could transform him into a lupine man-monster and send him on a murderous rampage across the city until he was finally beheaded by a paladin's holy sword, or make him speak an endless stream of gibberish until his vocal cords ruptured and he drowned in his own blood. Those were just a couple of colourful possibilities. Its resistance to attention did explain why Fraenk had dropped it in his safe box and forgotten about it. But now that he knew the jewellery's secret, Fraenk wondered if it might contain answers to so many other questions that were swirling around this mystery. Why had Meekan hidden it in the bread? Was it the reason why he was killed? What was its purpose, and why would the old man even have such a thing in the first place? The intellectual part of his mind said he had to try it on. This was easier in the saying than the doing, though. Fraenk felt his hands go cold and clammy as he opened the chain loop. His dull sense of boredom quickly became a whole-body fatigue. The closer he drew to it, that feeling became boiling disgust. Fraenk pushed past the sensation. His desire to wear the necklace became a repellent loathing. Trembling, he dropped his hands, a sheen of sweat on his brow. Whatever he did, Fraenk could not bring himself to get the loop around his neck. Finally he dropped his trembling hands, a sheen of sweat on his brow. "Oh, so that's how you play?" Fraenk smiled. "You are a naughty girl, aren't you?" A soft, almost imperceptible tapping came from his chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," Fraenk whispered, cupping the pendant secretively in his palm. "Fraenk?" Nim's voice filtered through. "I heard you was awake," he said timidly. "I wasn't listening or nothing, but it sounds like you've got a friend. I mean, I'll come back later when you're ready to, when you're back on the job, I mean." "I'll be right out," Fraenk chuckled. Fraenk quickly returned the room to its former condition. He slipped the pendant into an inner pocket on his cloak and met his subordinate in the hall. Nim took a curious glance over Frank's shoulder in an attempt to see who he was talking to, and was only left more curious when it appeared that he was speaking to no one at all. "Well, what's your report?" Fraenk asked, getting Nim's attention back. "Fraenk, it's definitely the Palewood Brethren, I think." Nim spoke in a conspiratorial tone. "Nim, I've been quietly following them, just like you showed me. They've been down at the port and the shipyard. They were even poking around the canals of Mosswater district until the dwarves run them off. I'm telling you, they're up to something." Nim's expression was of earnest concern. "Did they break any laws?" Fraenk asked. "Well, not in the strictest sense, but—" "So you spent 2 days following a bunch of shaved-head gorpers with an interest in boats? When you put it that way, you make it sound like an idiotic waste of time," Nim replied, crossing his arms defensively. "That's good, because I wasn't sure if I was being too subtle." Fraenk smiled. "It's a hurtful thing to say to someone who was just trying to do his job. At least I wasn't holed up in my tower doing who knows what with a hidden ghost woman." "I take your meaning, but guard that tongue around my ghost woman." Fraenk let Nim stew in distress for a moment before he could contain his laughter no longer. "No one likes a deceitful spy master, sir," Nim said sulkily. "Come on, I need you to track down some information for me. Find out if anyone else was murdered the same night Macon was killed. The partisans should have a record." "Where are you going?" Nim asked. "The last place I'm supposed to be, Fernbrook District." "Didn't the arch-partisan and Lady Blackroot both tell you not to have further contact with them?" Nim asked. "They did. And you're deliberately disobeying them," Nim said. "I have to." Fraenk started to walk away. "Sir," Nim called, making him pause, "I have something very important to ask you." "What is it?" Nim gave him a grave look. "If something happens to you and you don't come back, where do you hide all your coin?" Deep in the back alleys of Fernbrook District there was a secret shop. It was nowhere that an average person would stumble into looking for a chop of meat or cut of fabric. In fact, it was set up in a place most sane folks avoided at all costs, the back of a plague house. The proprietor of this ominous boutique was a coarse and unscrupulous man who served a unique niche within the greater community of Arathis, especially for those looking for highly specific information. For this man was a buyer, seller, and dealer of the magical, the charmed, and the cursed. While his business was not strictly legal within Arathis, and most of the items he traded in would be enough to see him wearing irons in prison, his presence was tolerated and even protected by those who valued his function. While the arcane lords and temple paladins were powerful magic users themselves, their dogmatic prohibition on its use for anyone else created an uncomfortable tension for those occasions when a little magic might be particularly advantageous. Or if, for example, one were to discover a mysterious magical item that needed to be identified for its function and side effects, asking an arcane lord would be the quickest way to see it confiscated and not receive any helpful answers in return. So, although Fraenk kept on friendly terms with the man, he knew this character was not at all to be trusted. He had a bad habit of bragging to Fraenk about all the other clients he brilliantly deceived about their item in question, whilst assuring Fraenk himself that his candour was never false. His truth was the confession as to being a liar. But with no better place to turn for answers, Fraenk found himself heading in the direction of Fernbrook District. It was somehow fitting the man would choose it of all places to operate. The elves there seemed to tolerate far more dubious activity than even the lowly Mosswater district, which was home to slums, gambling dens, and the city prison itself. Lord Fernbrook probably had no idea that it even existed. Greedy fool that he was, would probably try to exploit it for his own gain. Fraenk took a small joy in knowing this man was operating right under Fernbrook's nose. Fraenk took his time on a meandering, circuitous patrol route to arrive at the far side of the district. Several times he had the distinct feeling that he was being followed, but if by an individual or group, he caught no obvious tails. Fraenk did, however, notice a black raven watching him from on a wooden tavern sign, but it was too distant to tell if it was the same one who bespoiled his doublet. "Yes, Fraenk, a bird is out to get you." He silently mocked himself, then continued on. Within 3 blocks of Fernbrook district, Fraenk quickly ducked into a members-only bathhouse. He waited to see if anyone followed, then changed into a fat laundress disguise and used a secret passage to deposit him out of an adjacent building where steam billowed out in white clouds that smelled of lye soap. Blending in with some bundle-toting washerwomen heading toward Fernbrook textile dyers, Fraenk twice more switched disguises and used alternate building exits before emerging back on the street near the district border. To his own estimation, Fraenk had vanished into the role of a poor but fervent monk, whose holy service was to witness to the sick and dying. It was both a job and type of individual that most others avoided, so as to not catch a horrible disease, or, arguably worse, part of a sermon. Poor monk Fraenk ventured forth into the Fernbrook district. As he rounded the first corner, Fraenk nearly collided with 2 of the Fernbrook guards. They were both elves, and they stepped back to look at him. Their faces were young but bore a cruelty that reflected how they treated all their citizenry. For several heart-pounding moments, Fraenk lowered his head, hoping they didn't recognize him or his little adventure would be over before it started. "Watch where you're walking, dirty fool," the taller guard barked. "I'm sorry, sir," monk Fraenk bowed low. "I'm just on my way to tend to the sick and the dying, for as the words of St. Candlewax says and the tome of—" "Ugh, silence! Be off with you!" he shouted and raised his gauntleted hand to clout Fraenk, then lowered it again in disgust, not wanting to dirty his polished armour with any part of him. Fraenk bowed a few more times and then scurried off. After 20 minutes of walking and keeping to the less travelled streets, a gentle breeze picked up and cooled him in the itchy woolen robes. Fraenk was starting to feel more confident. Maybe this plan was going to work after all. Most passers-by either ignored him or avoided eye contact entirely. He made sure to avoid anywhere near the military training grounds where army recruits received their initial conditioning and encountered fewer of those wearing any of the sigils pledged to house Fernbrook. This journey had been a lot less dangerous before he made an enemy of one of the city's most powerful families. Fraenk wondered if he'd ever again be able to raise a pint in the legendary tavern, the King's Brigand, a notorious haunt where rugged adventurers from all parts of the land mixed with desperate people carrying a sack of coins, looking for a hero to solve their problem. Surely following any one of these quests would result in quite the epic tale. If only an enterprising scribe would follow along and write down the events. It could make for a thrilling read by candlelight before bed. Fraenk dismissed the idea. Leave that to someone else. Keeping his pace steady, Frank's mind began to go back over the details of the case. What did he know? Lord Fernbrook insisted on taking the bakery. Then, in the wake of the fire, having it swept entirely clean. The body of Bass Greenbrier burned up as well, along with his head full of worms. The mysterious Lynblood woman, Kyla, was searching for something there too. What word had she said? And finally, how did his new trinket fit into the entire puzzle? He was almost to the street corner that led down to the plague house, still trying to piece it all together. And some annoying bird kept making a pesky cawing noise. Walking on, Fraenk felt the answer was there if he could only concentrate. But the bird flapped aloft again and moved closer, its maddening squawks louder. Fraenk sped up. Maybe around the corner the bird would leave him to think, but it only launched itself aloft and dropped onto the road behind him. "Stupid crow," Fraenk growled, then stopped in his tracks. It was the crow. Fraenk spun around to confirm, and sure enough, there on the path, several paces back, was the mangy black bird with a cloudy eye. It blinked the other good eye and tilted its head. "What do you want?" Fraenk asked, unsure if he expected the bird to answer or not. The bird slowly spread its wings. With the missing feathers, it looked like the gap-toothed smile of an old hermit. It opened its beak and gave Fraenk a slow hiss. then with several jaunty bounces hopped into a nearby darkened alcove. Was the old bird trying to lead him somewhere? This was too odd to ignore. With a bemused scepticism, Fraenk walked after the crow. The moment Fraenk was out of view in the shadow of the alcove, a terrifying figure rounded the corner. He was tall, with dark red skin, cruel orange eyes under a slanting brow, and a large set of spiralling horns. The figure was of the cursed ones. The hell touched, and he was coming their way. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Greysage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.